a lot of like really sort of compelling thematic underpinnings there. Like, you know, you're talking a lot about like one thing I found really compelling is just sort of like this the way that you're infusing more of your sort of personal and emotional perspectives into your storytelling, being reflective of just like the nature of the documentary industry, sort of moving away from these sort of like, you know, colonialist like sort of journalistic
Yeah.
standard, like really embracing storytelling traditions like from communities of color like ours that, you know, don't sort of try to like eschew this idea of like emotionality and journalism being anathema to each other, which I think is super compelling to dig into. And you naturally sort of evolve from like speaking about your first film into the podcast. And I want to, before we go too much further into that, I feel like it'd be good for us to also just sort of like reset and say, like, you know, give us sort of a little bit of a description of like what the podcast is, what's the story, and then I think where you're going in terms of like how you navigated that idea of like being able to sort of like bring your personal story into the film, or in this case the podcast you're making, recognizing that there are some things from your lived experience that without the right level of nuance and context like might inadvertently reinforce the stereotypes that you're actually trying to break apart. And I would
Hmm.
love to hear you speak about like first like what is the podcast, and then how like tangibly did you really navigate that challenge, knowing that here's a story that like in the wrong hands or with the right with the wrong context could potentially uphold stereotypes that you are trying to break open and get underneath and dismantle a little bit. So I'd love to hear you sort of speak a little bit about that if you can.
So the podcast is a 8-part series that investigates the disappearance of a Canadian woman whose family's from Jordan, um, who disappeared in 2006 and was not reported missing for 9 years. She grew up about an hour away from me. And how I got on the story was from an anonymous email that someone sent saying, I think you should look into the story, and there's more to it than what's been reported. They were kind of cagey about how they knew this and why they were reaching out. But there was enough in that email that intrigued me that I began to look into this. And I think I naively thought that this will be an easy story to tell because I was like, "Is a woman missing in Canada? Like, how hard could that be? You know, either she's here or she's in Jordan, right? Like, that's bad." Um, so I think I naively thought I could do this story and it would not be that long, and that's it. Sure, let's do it. Um, and then it took up the next 3 years of my life. Um, and I was consumed by this story for a long time because it was so weird to recognize that this woman of color disappears for so many years, is missing, and nobody notices. Like, how does that even happen? How do you become so insignificant in the lives of people around you and in the community and your family that nobody cares that you're gone for 9 years? It was something that bugged me. Um, and that's what I began looking into. Um, it's an investigation. It's definitely rooted in a sort of journalistic practices. I tried to talk to as many people as I could in her life to try to find out what happened to her. What was initially a story about this mystery of this missing woman really ends up also being about a lot more things than I had initially thought. Um, it also became a profile of sorts of this woman and her life, her lived experiences. And what I think that's interesting about this is there's so many ways to take aspects of her life and see her as a oppressed Muslim woman who was mistreated by the world, and her family. It's very easy to read that version of the story. But what I saw was this woman who kept resisting. And it was her story of resistance that I think you could easily miss. And the ways she resisted, and just, you know, I think she was a badass. Like, she truly was. She was just like, I'm not, you want me to do that? No, not happening. Despite like whatever the consequences were, she was gonna do things her way, and she was gonna live her life her way. And that, I thought, was, I was intrigued by that, and the ways that she um resisted what was expected from her community, from her family. Um, and one of the things that comes up is, there are allegations of abuse in the home, um, before she went missing. And I have lived through something similar. I was, I grew up in a home that was at times abusive, and ultimately to the point that I left home, um, and was homeless, like literally homeless for a point in my life. And I never told anybody. I, first of all, it's not hard to not tell anybody. Nobody just assumes you were, you were homeless and didn't have a place to sleep. So I just said, like, oh, it just never came up. But it didn't come up because I didn't want it to come up. I was almost embarrassed by it, because I don't know, there was a feeling of embarrassment and shame that I associated with it, that I never reconciled, that I never wanted to talk about. So I just didn't. But when I began to tell her story, it sort of made me think about, why was I always silent about it? Why didn't I tell people? Why don't we talk about these things? Why should we talk about these things? What do we get out of it? And what happens when we're silent about them? And how dangerous that can be when you keep secrets, and when you bury secrets, and you don't want the world to know how dangerous secrets can be. Um, and as I mentioned, what worried me was having my story being hijacked by the narrative that I didn't want to be part of. That, oh, look, this is a oppressed Muslim woman. And I was really bothered. Like, I really did not want to be part of that narrative, because I don't see myself as that. I don't associate my experience, um, in growing up in my house, as one of oppression. I think that's very limited way to view that. I was The way I would describe it, I was living in a home where I didn't feel like this is not where I want to be, and I challenged what was expected of me, and I left because I was like, no, I deserve more, and I want more from life. But I can see how easy it is, without the nuance, to sort of take the story and paint it in a way of, here's another oppressed Muslim woman.
And how did you practically do that? Because I can imagine there's a lot of folks in the community, and maybe folks that are like, you know, creative folks or artists like watching this conversation that are like, yeah, like I have aspects of my lived experience, or I want to tell stories from within the community that may sort of, resonate with like a lot of the prevailing stereotypes in different ways. And how do I navigate around that? And so like practically, as you were telling this story, you know, telling a story that had some resonances with those themes, but very intentionally like not wanting to tell a story that would reinforce those stereotypes. Like, how practically did you navigate that in the creation of the podcast?
One thing I did was I reached out to women who had very different lived experience than I did, or I assumed that they did. And I some of them I knew well, and some of them I didn't. And I just reached out to them and I said, hey, I'm working on a project, and it does deal with abuse that is faced by Muslim women. And I want to make sure that I tell it in a way that if you heard it, you would not be offended by that. And it wasn't like I was looking to censor what, but I was
Right.
wanting to be truthful to the specifics of this story without telling it in a way that felt reductive to other Muslim women. So I talked to a lot of Muslim women and I said, how do you tell the story? How would you want a story? They didn't know all the details, but how would you want your community to talk about these experiences,
Mm.
even if you haven't lived through those? And it really helped me to, first of all, get out of my own head, right? And first I wonder, what maybe the answer is I can't. Maybe you can't. But I think talking to these women and just being honest with them, like, here's what I'm struggling with. What would a podcast look like or sound like that this experience is shared in, where you would go, yuck, this is not representative of me. This is not, and even if it's not representative of me, it does more harm than good.
Mm.
What would that sound like to you? How could that be done really badly, poorly? And then how do you think you would do it well? Like, what can you do when you're telling that story, which inherently is not a very positive story? What can you do, or what can anyone do to sort of acknowledge that, and to not
Mm.
have you feel as if you were the audience that this is misrepresenting my entire community? Those conversations were super helpful, and they helped me just sort of put things in context for myself, and also for how I would approach these scenes in the podcast. And the other thing that I did was, I'm surrounded by a team that's white, and I'm the only person of color, and I'm telling a story about people of color. And I think it's important not to forget that. And that it's not because I think the people I worked with were amazing, super talented, so much compassion. But you can't, like, if I was recreating some kind of a stereotype, I'm not sure if this room would have figured it out. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not sure if this room would have flagged that. Not because they're not amazing at their job, but it's because this is not what they live and breathe. Like, they might not know what it's like to experience racism every day of your life, right? Those are not the things they might think about. So what I did, and this was like, I talked with our team about this, and everybody was very supportive of this. Before we put out a podcast, after it was done, I sent it to a female Muslim journalist friend of mine who is really tough. And I respect her. And I know that if something isn't right, she's not going to tell me it's good. Like, she's not going to say this is okay if it's not okay. So I said to her, the only instruction, she was not part of our editorial team. She was not part of any conversation. I just said, can you listen to this? And anytime you get the icky feeling that this is representing my community or people in a way that I don't think is appropriate, just tell me. I want to know. And I was prepared. I was like really scared. I think that was my toughest critic. And I think that was what I needed to do to make sure I was telling the story fairly and accurately. And I strongly suggest reaching out to people who can be that, sound check for you, who can sort of gut check what you're about to put out into the world. So I think those gut checks are important, because sometimes it's not really like, you can't always intellectually think through how people might feel about what you're putting out. Sometimes it's just a feeling. Sometimes it just added together, it just reinforces stereotypes in ways that are really harmful to a community that's already constantly under siege. So those were I think the practical things I could think of that I did to be able to honor the experiences of women who we talked to in the story, but also make sure it doesn't come across as this is the experience of all people in our community.
So much practical, there's so many practical applications to what you just said, but I think there's something really thematically important to underline in that, which is like, you're working with, sort of like an all white editorial team, and you are, sort of like the creative leader at the center of this project. And there's this assumption that, like, you're telling the story about a woman of color, you're a woman of color, you're telling the story about a Muslim woman, you're a Muslim woman, and there's this expectation that because you share these sort of demographic identities with the subject of this story or the protagonist of this story, then that's sort of all that's needed. But like, everyone's lived experience is so different. There's no sort of way to completely sort of like have this sort of mirror image between like who is creating the story and whose story is being told. And so it speaks to the value, even outside of these sort of like authorship questions of, having stories about particular communities be told by people from those communities. But even outside of that, just the value of collaboration, the value of really sort of engaging with a really sort of a broad cross section of folks that can enable any storyteller to be able to make sure that you're avoiding those kinds of pitfalls that you were seeking to avoid with this story. So I think there's a lot in that, because I think a lot of folks feel like this question of authorship and who gets to tell what story, who should be telling what story, is a very sort of simple calculus. But like, even when you do have someone from a community telling a story about that community, it's still really important to have other voices in that room to collaborate and bounce things off of, to ensure that there is this sort of diversity of lived experience that is being brought to bear, particularly for a film or a piece of journalism or a podcast, to ensure that you're sort of avoiding some of the pitfalls that you're looking to avoid. I think it's so important to underline. So I'm really glad that you spoke to that.